Today, we're doing a bit of historical detective work. We are going to methodically and impartially unpack a really fascinating document, a pamphlet from 1904 titled Socialism and the Worker. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides, but to examine exactly what this text argued and how it tried to persuade its audience over a century ago. So, let's just jump right in.
The author kicks things off with a pretty dramatic claim. They point out that socialists at the time were being heavily vilified, accused of wanting to destroy the very fabric of society, things like property, marriage, and the family. But the text argues that these extreme accusations were actually a deliberate smokescreen, created by those who just wanted to defend their own privileges and monopolies from public scrutiny.
To truly understand where this is coming from, we need to anchor ourselves in the timeline. The text was originally published in 1876, but the version we're exploring was popularized and republished by the Social Democratic Federation in Britain in 1904. This gives us a really direct, unfiltered window into the early labor movement and how they communicated their core theories right at the height of the industrial era.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the context of the 1904 pamphlet, then move into debunking the wealth myth, explore capital versus labor, redefine communism and property, and finally, look at their plans for organizing for the future.
All right, Section 1, the 1904 Socialist pamphlet and contextualizing the argument.
What's really interesting here is how the author speaks directly to the skepticism of the working class. The pamphlet openly acknowledges that many workers were actually terrified of socialism, but it attributes this fear to misinformation, or what the author wonderfully calls specters in the dark. The stated aim is simply to lay out the truth of their goals. The author essentially makes a deal with the reader: look at these facts impartially. If the ideas are bad, keep hating them. But if they make sense, you should support them.
Moving on to Section 2, debunking the wealth myth, or as we like to call it, smashing trains and splitting coins.
So, the biggest myth the pamphlet tackles is this idea that socialists just want to take all existing physical property and divide it up equally. The text calls this sheer lunacy. It asks a highly practical question: to whose lot should a railroad fall? I mean, think about it. If everyone gets an equal share, you'd have to physically smash the train to pieces. One person gets a broken axle, another gets a carriage door. It's a completely ridiculous scenario used to prove that literally dividing up physical assets is not what they're after at all. To drive this point home, the pamphlet shares a pretty great anecdote from 1848 about the incredibly wealthy Baron Rothschild. Supposedly, two laborers walked right up to him on the street and made this exact demand, saying, "Baron, you are a rich man. We want to divide with you."
And how does the Baron respond? Well, he just does the math. He notes he has 40 million florins and there are 40 million Germans, so he hands the laborers exactly one single florin each and just walks away smiling. The author uses this story to show that simply dividing up a rich man's money equally is just an idle invention. It's a band-aid that doesn't actually solve systemic poverty or change the underlying condition of the workers.
Which brings us to Section 3, Capital versus Labor, which lays out the core economic argument.
The crucial point here is captured perfectly by John Stuart Mill, who was actually a prominent non-socialist thinker at the time. He stated that the produce of labor is in an almost inverse ratio to the labor. The pamphlet leans heavily on this quote to argue that the people who do the most exhausting, backbreaking work receive the absolute least, while those who never work at all somehow reap the largest rewards.
The text then frames this economic reality as this epic conflict. On one side, you have dead property, which is capital, the means of production. On the other side, you have living work, which is the physical and mental strength of the laborers. The pamphlet argues that dead property acts as a literal enemy, extracting the fruits of the living work. They use a fantastic analogy here, comparing capitalists to the owner of a beehive who claims the legal right to just take all the honey the bees worked so hard to make, leaving them with barely enough to survive.
Section 4, redefining communism and property, and reclaiming those scary words.
To offer a real solution to this conflict, the author knows they have to address the elephant in the room. They ask directly, what is communism? They knew full well that most readers back in 1904 automatically associated that word with theft, scoundrels, and rascality.
But look at how the pamphlet attempts to redefine it. It states that communism is simply the principle of the common interests of society. It frames it as a protective barrier against what it calls ugly egoism, which is the idea of people exclusively looking out for themselves, even at the cost of everyone else. The author is trying to completely rebrand the term from something dangerous into something that just means public welfare. To ground this abstract idea in reality, the pamphlet points to everyday institutions that people already loved and relied on: the one-penny post office, common public roads, public schools, waterworks, and fire brigades. The author's argument is that society already relies heavily on these shared public systems. Therefore, if you hate the principle of common interest, you technically have to hate the fire brigade and the post office.
And this leads perfectly into their redefined view of property. The text claims it has absolutely no intention of abolishing personal belongings. You get to keep your clothes, your house, your personal items. Instead, the goal is a transition. It wants property of capital, meaning the private ownership of huge things like factories, land, and railroads, to gradually transform into the property of work, meaning these massive systems of production would be owned collectively by the people who actually operate them.
Now for Section 5, Organizing for the Future. This is the ultimate call to action.
Shifting from theory to practice, the text lays out clear historical steps for the labor movement. First, workers across all trades must realize they share the exact same struggles. They need to comprehend this solidarity of interests. Second, they have to fight for immediate, practical changes like decreasing working hours. Third, the long-term goal is to expropriate the means of production from the wealthy few. And fourth, the only way to achieve any of this is to organize into one formidable, united power.
What's incredibly fascinating here is how specific their practical demands were. The major stepping stone highlighted in the text is the 8-hour workday, and they didn't just pull this number out of thin air. The pamphlet notes that physicians at the time actually justified 8 hours as the maximum healthy limit. It argues that workers have a fundamental right to time for recreation, instruction, and just being with their families, rather than endlessly toiling away. To persuade the reader to actually step up and join the movement, the author uses a really brilliant, easy-to-understand analogy. Unorganized labor is compared to a single matchstick. It's isolated, powerless, and incredibly easy for an employer to just snap in half. But organized labor, that's like a tightly tied bundle of matches. Together, they form a formidable power that is nearly impossible to break.
Wrapping things up, the pamphlet concludes with a surprisingly bold historical comparison, likening the persecution of the early socialist movement to the persecution of early Christianity. The author makes this profound assertion: if it is bad, it will die of its own badness. If it is good, it will conquer the world in spite of all persecutions. It's a massive rhetorical mic drop, leaving the ultimate judgment squarely in the hands of the reader and, of course, the test of time.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis of this fascinating 1904 text. But it leaves us with a really big question to consider about our own modern world. If everyday institutions like roads and schools operate on the principle of common interest, where exactly does society draw the line between public good and private enterprise today? It's a debate that was raging over a century ago, and as you can probably tell, it's a debate that is absolutely still shaping our world right now.